On July the 11th of that year, a procession of English armoured cars, tanks and patrols began to move slowly back onto the barracks. There were little crowds in the streets, very watchful and very silent. And then, just as the Angelus rang out from the city churches, the barrack gates opened. The soldiers filed in with a final cheer or a joke, and the gates closed behind them again. I wondered if it really meant that it was all over, that in fact it was the end of 700 years of occupation.
We had a regular unit of the volunteers here in Dublin. This regular unit was known as the Dublin Guards. That was the unit that took over Dublin Castle, which was probably the first establishment that was handed over by the British. I remember it well. It was taken over by Collins. A lot of pomp and ceremony there that day. I happened to be present myself. And the British were lined up and all their officials were there, in morning dress, etc. I can recall Collins coming in an old LAC taxi. Collins happened to be a few minutes late, and this imperious official approached him and he said, "Mr. Collins, you're 7 minutes late." So Collins looked at him and in a real Cork accent he said, "Blast you." He said, "So you people are here 7 centuries, and what bloody difference will 7 minutes make now that you're leaving?"
There are two very clear recollections of my father showing me, I suppose, early in 1922, a contingent of British troops marching, leaving Ireland for the last time, coming from the barracks in South Circle Road, subsequently called Griffith Barracks. But I remember very vividly my father recalling, "This is an occasion you'll remember."
I remember my mother saying to me on one occasion, "You never saw British uniforms on the streets as of right." I did. And that was the great difference between people who were born before the foundation of the state.
I think the treaty document, the signed treaty document, is possibly one if not the most important document in terms of underpinning the existence of the new state. On the left-hand side, we have the signatories from the British delegation, including names like Lloyd George, Birkenhead and Churchill, which are names that resonate for people in terms of the Irish psyche. On the right-hand side, we have the Irish delegation: Collins, Griffith, Duggan, Barton and Gavin Duffy. All of them signed in Irish and with using the old Irish script as well to boot. Now this surely has to be a very significant statement of de-Anglicisation, if you like, of cutting loose from the demand to satisfy what might have been seen as the superior country and culture for a very long time. And I think it tells us a great deal about what these men were thinking at the time and what their aspirations might have been culturally as well as politically for the future of the country.
On the Fine Gael side, of course, there was the belief that Collins's freedom to achieve freedom would in fact have achieved the ultimate freedom, whereas the Fianna Fáil and De Valera view was, often expressed in very doctrinaire terms, that the treaty was in fact a surrender, was Ireland abandoning its most cherished aspirations, its most cherished ambitions.
De Valera knew from meetings with Lloyd George that there was no way the Crown could be eliminated from the Irish Constitution. And immediately when Collins and Griffith and those came back with the treaty, which appeared to be a very reasonable settlement between the two sides, he announced in public that the treaty was in conflict with the will of the Irish people. And of course it wasn't.
It was only when I came to read the small print, feeling in the, shall we say, in Northern Ireland, to use the term which is used in the treaty and which is embraces that the particular territory with which we were concerned. When I, knowing what the feeling was in Northern Ireland, it seemed to be quite inevitable that they would opt out within the stated period, as they did. And then their opting out, according to the terms of the treaty, meant that we were going to be partitioned.
My mother's family were, if anything, more anti-treaty than my father, if that were possible. My father was thinking of the North, of course. But my mother was thinking far more, I'd say, of the oath. He was thinking of partition. She was thinking of the Crown.
In the War of Independence, the development of Republican thinking, particularly Enlightenment thinking from the French Revolution, was yet a further reason why people would not want to swear an oath of allegiance to a British monarch. Collins, however, saw the oath really as an empty formula because he, in the treaty, had got substance. He had got independence, he had got freedom. But the opponents of the treaty saw the oath as the stumbling block, as the point beyond which they could not go.
I couldn't swallow an oath of allegiance to the King of England. Not today. Couldn't swallow it. I couldn't do it. Not for £1 million could I do it. Not for all Ireland could I do it.
Most of the women who were in the Dáil, say, during the treaty debates, were there because they were related to or married to men who had been active in the struggle. One in particular was Mary McSweeney, whose brother, as we know, died on hunger strike. She ends up on hunger strike herself in Mountjoy in November of 1922, and if you think of the scene, her sister is outside the gate, swathed in furs, sleeping there overnight, crowds of people coming up to lend support to her.
She had this logic and this strength of character, and what was really causing her problem was the oath. She had sworn an oath to uphold this republic and defend it, etc., etc. They all did. She couldn't see how they could turn their backs on this after a couple of years.
The treaty was accepted by 64 votes to 57, majority of 7. And with that, the opponents of the treaty walked out of it. Didn't recognise Dáil Éireann, and they formed some kind of a shadow government of their own outside.
Two groups of people despised or hated or condemned the Dublin government that was struggling to be born between 1921 and 1923. The first, of course, was the anti-treaty IRA under Liam Lynch, and at least notionally under Eamon de Valera. The other, of course, was the Unionist government in Belfast, who were hoping for Dublin to collapse so that it would prove their point, which is the Irish were not fit for self-government.
The acceptance of the treaty was comparatively easy for educated people, for intellectuals, but the mass of the people were quite unaware of what was happening. Here was a new society by which they were totally unprepared. Here was a society in which they'd be governing themselves. What did that mean? Most of them were perplexed by the very thought of sending representatives to a parliament in Dublin.
One of the strange things about the Civil War situation in 1922-23 was that on one point anyway, extreme Republicans and mainline Unionists agreed their contempt for the Irish attempt at self-government.
You don't usually form an army in time of war. This one was literally being put together in the state of war, because there was practically a civil war starting on our doorstep. It had been going on in small incidents beforehand. Irregulars had been taking over buildings and occupying them. And down through the country, they were pleasing themselves. What they were trying to do, I really don't know, other than the fact that it was quite obvious they were trying to upset the state as it was. And this had to be stopped.
The regular army was being organised and headquarters was established in Beggar's Bush Barracks. So a situation like that couldn't possibly last, and no government could accept it. So it was bound to happen that the rift would develop and become more serious, and so it did with the attack on the forecourt.
It was suggested that they be starved from water supply cut off, and food supplies cut off. I'm afraid I personally objected to that. I was by way of being director of operations, amongst other problems, and I advocated shelling it. I mounted a gun at the points where I thought they'd be most advantageous. Then I tried to instruct a team of 4 on how to load this gun. I had completely overlooked the fact that you've got to put the tail of the gun under something to stop the repercussion. The first thing that happened was the gun jumped back and knocked 3 of us out, practically. But the shell landed anyhow at the forecourts.
The end result of that was the destruction of the Public Record Office, which contained the records of Irish administrative and legal history from the 13th century up to the 19th century. It was used as the munitions block by the occupying forces and was struck by a shell and blown to Kingdom Come. Now, basically, all of those records were destroyed with very few survivals.
Quite frankly, I think the Civil War was, from the point of view of this country, quite a disaster. I don't think I've made any secret of that at any time. But one gets into these situations not as a result of cold thought and calm judgment.
My father always thought De Valera was the major factor in causing the Civil War. He always maintained that if De Valera had accepted the treaty, there would have been no civil war. The great majority of people in Parliament would have supported the treaty.
Looking back on things, I don't think anyone ever accused De Valera of having started the civil war. The foulest propaganda that was ever pulled off in Ireland was De Valera made a speech, I think it was in Wexford, about wading through the blood of our brothers. And that was translated into an incitement. But what he was doing was lamenting the possibility of it happening.
Michael Collins, as is now well known, had no intention of discontinuing the fight. Other members of his government certainly had, to their credit, but he had not. His idea was a clandestine fight using the Republican forces in the north. I mean, that was Michael Collins' plan of action.
You never think in terms of what's wise and what's not wise when you're talking about Michael Collins. He was a law unto himself. He had a devout love for his people. They didn't understand him.
My first meeting with Mr. De Valera was when he was going south to the tragic conjuncture of forces that resulted, among other things, in the death of Mick Collins. I was just a baby, and the party that was going south with Dev, the men in the trench coats, arrived at the door, and as was the usage at the time, everyone got up to let them sleep for a bit on their journey. And I was sleeping in the big bed inside my mother, and my mother went to lift me out, and he said, "Leave her. I have 5 of my own," so she did.
The roads had been harassed. I mean, they had trees cut across roads and they had ditches dug across roads to make transport difficult.
A lot of the anti-treatyites, for example, did not want to fight the Free State, and their disadvantage was that they were disunited. The Free State were quite united in one project anyway. That was the defeat of the anti-treaty forces militarily in the field.
If there was a weakness in Collins, it would be that he would make a compromise to try and save or create a unity. It has been said since that he had this in mind, but he didn't discuss it with me. It was a fluke. Well, it should never have happened.
Collins couldn't be taken to Dublin by land. There was a danger that the cortege would be ambushed, the train might be blown up. So he was taken by boat, and the boat left from the Lee around into Queenstown or Cove, where the British Army, of course, were still in residence, but they were only a remnant of what used to be there. And then the boat followed the coast around and on up to Dublin, where Collins was laid in state in the Pro-Cathedral. As that cortege went through the city, the people stood in numbed silence as they watched not just the death of a chieftain or of a great leader, but also possibly the death of this state that they were trying to bring into being.
At eventide, the boat proceeded very slowly down the River Lee. Everybody was grief-stricken, including the members of the crew and the members of the guard that were doing honor to the chieftain. And when we were coming out into the harbour, I was surprised to notice that the British destroyer fleet was in line astern and their sailors dressed alongshore. And we were greeted with a salute of trumpets. And this was fantastic over the waves, unbelievable. And as we quietly went further on, they saluted, and then they sounded the last post. Looking around the harbour, Queenstown Harbour,
I noticed that all the windows all around had lights in them, candles or some light of some description, as a sort of a farewell tribute. It was a very emotional time.
The slogan I can recall now, I think it was painted on Trinity College wall very shortly after Collins being killed. And of course it was very, very offensive. The words on it were, "Move over, Mick, and make way for Dick."
After Collins' death, of course, he was on his own in fighting the Civil War. But he bore the brunt of the really difficult decisions, the executions.
One member of the Dáil had been killed. The vice chairman had been wounded. There were other indications that there were going to be many attacks on them, and the only way we thought to defend the Dáil effectively was to resort to counter-terror.
The 4 people who were executed from Mountjoy, they were imprisoned there since the Four Courts incident in June 1922. The end of November 1922, they were simply told the night before that they were going to be executed, and they were brought out without any warning beforehand, and they were shot early next morning. It was an extraordinary event, it was a tragic event, it was an illegal event, but the country was at war.
There were extreme measures, but they were taken in extreme circumstances. And war is never a child's play.
It was my Uncle Paddy who wrote the poem, you know, Rory and Liam and Dick and Joe, Star of the Morning, Mary Come, the big Republican poem.
I saw a soldier kneeling in the sentry box. Whoever he was, I suppose he knew the men who had been executed. And there was a gloom over the prison, or over the whole city that day. There was a dark cloud.
It was of an extraordinary intensity. I have spoken to some of the veterans in old age, and even then, a kind of extraordinary emotional intensity pervaded them. Sean Lemass, in the late 1960s, referring to the divisions of 1922 and the people on both sides, said, on both sides they did terrible things, and they knew it. Eamon de Valera, Liam Lynch, and the others on the anti-treaty side were really fighting a civil war in which they did not believe themselves. But Liam Lynch wanted to fight on forever. When he was killed, the civil war evaporated. The IRA men simply buried their arms in caches around the country and went home.
It's impossible for us nowadays, for the present generation, to visualise what the physical damage of the Civil War was. but the physical damage was a very small area, to my mind, compared with the psychological damage.
Did I examine my conscience? No, I didn't. This is one of these periods when emotion overthrows reason.
I'm still conscious of it. The enormous emotional surge is still there where I'm concerned. It's a personal thing.
I was also brought up with the constant reminder that 77 people had been executed by the Free State Army during the Civil War, and any time my father was mentioned by any people in the opposition, I was reminded about the 77.
Most disastrous bitterness. But it also acted as a spur in my official business to show that we Republicans could do it. It was a motivation in my official life that we Republicans could do it better than those bastards. Yes. That my wife, who was equally involved in the Civil War, equally with me, she was involved in the Civil War, she and I made every effort to keep that feeling away from our children. And I think with great success.
The new state had overcome the difficulties of the Civil War and was now putting in place the democratic institutions. And so the new Parliament of the Saoirse Éireann is situated in what would have been seen by people over the decades as a symbol of British imperialism. The new state had its symbols. The new state had a parliament. The new state had a functioning government. The leader of this was W.T. Cosgrave, not in any sense a sort of a man of charismatic personality like Collins, but a steely figure who, throughout the 1920s, provided the type of leadership that was necessary to do the mundane work, the unheroic work, the unrelentingly tedious work of establishing a state over a period of 10 years.
The rights and liberties secured by the treaty must be preserved. The fullest possible advantage must be taken of our membership of the British Commonwealth of Nations and of our proximity to the British market.
So many rosy things had been believed about what an Irish government would do. Nearly all of us thought, to some extent at any rate, that prosperity would arise instantaneously if we got rid of British rule. And of course the harsh realities began to dawn on people during that first period.
When W.T. Cosgrave took over on day one, he took over a state where public expenditure was dominated by expenditure on defence and military activities to the tune of over 50%. And his main objective would not have been long-term economic recovery, it would have been short-term survival.
They had to convince people that the state could survive. They had to get the banks to invest in the state. That took a great deal of effort, and I know my father convinced the Bank of Ireland, the directors at the time were Andy Jemison and a man named H.S. Guinness, and they gave a loan which helped to sustain the state and the government. There were no outside resources. In other words, whatever cost had to be met from what the government could raise. And for a considerable time, a lot of people thought it might not survive.
The damage caused by the Civil War was manifold. The economic fabric of the country was destroyed. Nobody would come and set up business in a country that was racked by civil war. Normality was probably not restored until the late 1920s, so they had a decade of governance in abnormal times.
A lot of things had happened that affected it, like destruction of property, bridges, quite a few main roads, bridges like the viaduct in Mallow.
The cornerstone of the Cumann Gael policy, that is the party of the new government, were legitimacy, to establish popular legitimacy for the new state. And that was particularly difficult because of the continuation of the echoes of the Civil War and the continued activities of the defeated IRA. They also wanted to establish economic stability to industrialise the new state, particularly difficult in the context of the fact that the state was bankrupt. They wanted also to improve the educational system. They wanted to ensure that there was an unarmed Garda or police force operating throughout the state.
People in this country had been used to an armed police previously, and to get them to accept an unarmed police was a great achievement.
And they wanted an army that was apolitical, a professional army that would maintain its allegiance to that state irrespective of who was running the state.
The system worked. It was a very formidable achievement. As well as that, they got Ireland into the League of Nations, which of course secured international recognition for the country. Later they opened diplomatic relations with the Vatican, with the United States and a number of other countries. Of course, it started in a small way, but the Vatican connection in 1929 was the first nuncio here since Rinuccini. One particular item I remember, we went to Mass on a Sunday morning, and my father actually was driving the car. I was only a young lad with him. We had a man with us who worked for us. And on the way back, he got a puncture. And they changed the wheel. When we got home, my mother dashed out, somewhat excited. She just had word that Kevin O'Higgins had been shot. And because we were delayed, she thought that there was an attack all around. A number of people called home, and then there was the question of whether my father would go in to see Kevin O'Higgins, but he decided he had a better chance of living by not having visitors, and he died in the evening. That had a very big effect on him. From that on, we had a military guard on the house, and all ministers had military escorts.
The assassination of Kevin O'Higgins was a dagger in the heart of the Free State. Kevin O'Higgins was the Minister for Home Affairs or Justice, and clearly the IRA, by taking Kevin O'Higgins out, were actually saying to Cosgrave and his colleagues, we haven't gone away. And Cosgrave and his colleagues were looked at the assassination and said, is this 1922, 23 all over again? Is this the IRA coming back? So Cosgrave's reaction was a decisive reaction to crush the IRA at that point by introducing really stern legislation.
Now, I would have thought that for the first few years of freedom, a great many still relished the symbols of the old regime. I can recall being brought to the horse show, for instance, in 1926 and 1927. I can recall very vividly indeed the crowd singing God Save the King when the British team appeared, the crowd remaining silent when the Irish team appeared.
The fundamental, I think, belief of the Unionists, going back well into the 19th century, was that the British Isles, Scotland, Wales, England and Ireland, formed a cultural unity which should also be a political unity. The two went together. The unified British Isles was the centre, the very active centre of a great empire. And therefore the Unionists was both able to take part in the joint life of the four nations that made up the British Isles, and was able to play his part in the imperial sphere. One resolute ex-Unionist lady who firmly wouldn't use the name Dunleary when she was going home in the afternoon. She would get onto a tram and ask firmly for Kingstown. The conductor would say, "Sorry, madam, not on our route." Oh, she said, "I made a mistake." She'd get off and get on the next tram, and the result, without sacrificing her principles, she travelled back without paying a penny. What struck me coming from the north, and I was reminded of these changes by people I talked to in Dublin. The pillowboxes were now green. I think it was then impossible for the person who wanted to use a red pillowbox to find one.
The first thing that the post office did was to paint the post boxes green. Even today you can see still a lot of the old English Victorian post boxes.
Painted green. Some people say, of course, that's all we ever did in Ireland, but we did more than that. I think we should look at this early English series of stamps which were just stamped over with Saorstad Éireann. When did we get our own definitive series then from the new Free State of the Irish stamp?
Straight away, February 1923, this particular stamp here, which is a one-penny stamp.
Beautiful design.
A beautiful stamp. It's a full Ireland.
Yeah, there's no partition in that.
No partition.
Yeah.
So.
And is the four provinces from that time as well?
In 1923, they came out with almost 10 separate stamps.
Yeah. This is a kind of Free State, if you like, iconography. And then when Fianna Fáil come in the early 30s, and with the new constitution of De Valera in 1937, you get a more Celtic, slightly more idealistic, artistic kind of a stamp, which I think sum up De Valera very much.
No, the constitution stamp is definitely more defined.
Yeah.
It's bringing in the fact with the harp.
Yeah.
And with the law and the four provinces once again.
Yeah.
A new Ireland, a new state.
The tricolour flew. The police and the army were using new uniforms. And all this to me, a northerner, was rather foreign, and to the older generation of the ex-Unionist world was startling.
The Irish language had symbolic significance in that every time you put an Irish word where there had been an English word, you reinforced this message. You reinforced it on your stamps, you reinforced it on your coins, you reinforced it on everything that people use every day of the week.
We were looking for some things that would justify our claim to statehood, something which would mark us off from the mighty neighbour who had been our affliction, or so we saw it, for quite a long time. One of those, of course, was the Irish language. Another was the matter of religion. The Irish language, I suppose, didn't mean very much internationally, but the Catholic religion was something which you don't need to mention it anywhere in the world, and for good or evil, people knew what it was. Internationally, I'd say the Catholic religion was very much a distinguishing mark of the new state. For centuries, England, later Britain, had been the dominant Protestant power through the world. We find it hard now to recover the reality of British power about 1920, or the strength of Britain as a Protestant power. So yes, it was something that marked us off as being Irish.
The way in which the Catholic Church had to operate prior to independence was very different to the way it could operate once we became independent. It operated prior to independence in a cosmopolitan, multi-denominational system of the United Kingdom, and it had to be very careful how it operated in order to achieve its ends. But once we became independent, it seems that the hierarchy of the Catholic Church with the support of successive Irish governments, saw this as an opportunity to turn the Free State and subsequently the Republic into a Catholic state. And they worked, it appears, hand in glove on occasions to do this.
Those of the Protestant minority in the 26 counties in the Free State who had served in the civil service, in the army and the police, many of them from 22 for the next 4 years, just left. Some of them went to the north, some of them went to Britain. When partition occurred, with the industrial heartland of Northern Ireland remaining within the United Kingdom, the 26 county state was so homogenous that it was difficult for minorities, whether they were writers, Protestants, or other groups, Labour, for example, to oppose the ruling ideology.
Those who remained felt that they had to keep their heads down and keep a very, very low profile, lest they should be accused in any way of being disloyal to the new state. And so that led Protestants to adopt almost a subservient attitude, to be hesitant on all occasions to offer any word of criticism about the new state.
Those who stayed, some of those might have hoped that the Boundary Commission would have produced a situation where the North and the South came closer together. But after the failure of the Boundary Commission, partition was cemented.
I don't think that was an important issue where you drew the boundary. The issue really was that the industrial heartland of the island of Ireland was not in the jurisdiction of Saor Stát Éireann. And that this probably defined our future for at least 50 years.
What this Boundary Commission did was to create a border of 320 miles, which was unpoliceable, which was clearly opened to sort of continuous subversive activity, which would lead to economic dislocation because of smuggling and the black market. And it remained from the 20s through to the 90s until the peace agreement as the major destabilising force on the island of Ireland.
The setting up of an independent jurisdiction which, with the exclusion of the 6 northeastern counties, was well over 90% Catholic. It obviously added a new dimension to coming into its own, but the Catholic Church was coming into its own quite a bit through the 19th century.
For many in the new state, the image of the Irish countryman on his small farm in the west, or the fisherman in his curragh fishing off the Aran Islands, was the quintessential Irishman. It was in the name of his civilization that the War of Independence had been fought. It was to create an Ireland that had its point of origin in this island off the west coast.
Fer an fado agus fadóí amach sin nuirnan ní bheith sin sean. nó amach sinis nó nuair sin an, bheith scéal nó sean scéal aige, sin nó bheith sé go naon scéal. Agus más fear atá sé agam san nacht, go mu seach fear bheith sé aga sé blianú nacht. Agus más fear nó mar an fear, mar chaile sé bleis, ach stíal gom híal, réise gon charabad, péir gon chláiríochla, nó dás dar agus faidir siar me.
This remained an inspirational force in much of the art and in the poetry and in the music that was celebrated for decades to come.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innes free, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade.
He leaves to the Catholic native country people and bourgeoisie the gift of a world rendered, a world entitled art, in which the new, anxious, culturally deprived state can say, well, we have got a great world artist who put our weather into the world, who put us into the world. So it reassures the emergent free state, independent state. He actually helps the Irish Protestants who might feel a bit of bad faith at staying on in the Free State. Here is a great world artist, their voice, who committed himself completely to Ireland. Unapologetically nationalist. Nationalism was a feature of his thought, and he never flinched from that.
The Saor Stott Éireann official handbook, published by the government, was the statement. And in it, we find a demonstration of the imaging of the Irish Free State. We find the works of numerous painters who were the established group, the group who were acceptable to show the image of the new Ireland. It's been called a corporate identity. That's probably a bit strong, but it certainly makes the picture clear of what they thought Ireland was.
Walter Osborne had been here. After that came Keating and Orpin and McGonigal and my father. My father happened to meet Pádraig Ó Conradh, and he said, now Pádraig, you're from the west of Ireland. Where can I paint? I want to paint landscape, sky in particular. And he said, you come to Galway City and you get all the sky you want. So he came on the train and Pádraig met him at the station. And from there on, it just took off. He had left Portadown, a town of chimney pots, linen fields, linen factory, linen industry. And here in Connemara, he had found something that he was always looking for.
We have the images, the icons of the new state. And we begin to see them first here in the centre with this couple. This group of two people, the businessman and the gunman. And the businessman looks disdainfully at the gunman. He detests him. He's not relevant anymore. Surrounding them are the priest, who unfortunately is still reading by candlelight. And the old workers who are using the gaslight. The old Ireland has been strung up, the skeleton. But the new Ireland is in fact Keating himself and his family, pointing to the new horizon, the dynamic, energised, technological Ireland, which is going to sweep away the vestiges of linkage to the old enemy. This is an independence picture, an independence image. And in all its details, we have encapsulated a didactic icon which speaks to us as much today at the end of the 20th century as of its time in the late 1920s.
We started the first industrialization. We started a good policy in regard to agriculture. We inaugurated the Shannon scheme. We started the sugar beet industry. I think perhaps the achievement was that we got things going.
Making all allowances for the Civil War and the difficulties that presented them with, and you must make considerable allowances for that. They were fundamentally and philosophically useless to the Irish nation as far as the economic development of the country. They did one thing. They brought in a civil service which was incorruptible. They left that behind them in the Shannon scheme and nothing else.
A number of the newspapers thought it was extravagant, that it was unsound, that it was too big. And the opposition at the time, I think, opposed it as well. But in fact, of course, no matter how big it wasn't even big enough. But it was ridiculed and it succeeded. And my father opened it in 1929.
Oh, were I Homer, that ancient roamer, I'd write a poem on a noble theme, to sing the story and chant the glory of that wondrous project, the Shannon scheme. In Belly Valley, midst Oak and Sally, I sat me down and I dreamt a dream of more employment and more enjoyment and happier homes by this Shannon scheme.
W.T. Cosgrave took over a country that was totally bereft of manufacturing industry. We were an agricultural country and had become so throughout 100 years of union with Britain. We were the food providers for the United Kingdom. The industrial specialisation was in the northeast corner in Belfast, shipbuilding, engineering, linen, and we lost that. So he had to construct a manufacturing sector from zero, and it was not really started until the next decade.
At the end of the 1920s, it was clear that political change was in the air. De Valera had got into the Dáil, Fianna Fáil had performed well in opposition, the state looked relatively secure, and also it looked as if there was a possibility of the unthinkable happening. That is, Fianna Fáil would replace Cumann na Gael. The party that was identified with starting the Civil War would come to power in Ireland.